Hi there, welcome. This is week 6, English 122, Pikes Peak Community College. We're doing the online version of the course. This week we changed to the third unit of our course, the persuasion section. You just finished your basic argument unit, arguing to convince, and now we're moving into arguing to persuade. And there seems to be a nuanced difference between convincing and persuasion. We want to really see if we can hone that out as you move into your final unit, which would be the researched argument. Upcoming information, the project abstract proposal for your final project is due this coming Sunday, the 25th. And I wanted to congratulate you. The work I've seen in your writing and in your discussion posts is fantastic. It's engaged, it's thoughtful, it's well developed. You are having no problems at all. And I'm thrilled to see that. I can't wait to see the extended arguments that you come up with and the proposals that you put forth. If you have any questions about what an abstract looks like or a project proposal looks like for this specific project, let me know. I'm happy to help you in any way I can. So this week we're moving into persuasion. The difference between convincing and persuading, seems to be a similar word. It's in the same wheelhouse. But when you're convincing someone, you're asking them to agree with you. When you're persuading someone, you're attempting to get them to do something. So you're seeking action, not just asking them to agree with you, but asking them to do something. And that should start calling attention to the things we've been talking about the so what. So the connection between what your purpose is and the so what then fuse together more strongly in persuasion, an argument to persuade. But this week, the next couple of weeks, we're going to go back into the reader mode to look at how other writers are constructing their rhetorical argument. The rhetorical argument, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So they're using specific strategies and devices to make appeals to their readers in order to get that reader to do the so what, to go along with the project, to agree and then to do. So we want to look at, as a reader, what kinds of appeals that these authors will be looking at the next 3 weeks. What appeals are they making, and are they effective? Are they persuasive? And we want to look at those specific elements. The 3 elements we're going to be looking at, the rhetorical strategies we'll be working with, are ones that you had in 121. And if you haven't had that course, the specific ones we're looking at are logos, the appeal to logic, pathos, the appeal to emotion, and ethos, which is appealing to ethics. We'll talk about those things tonight. So tonight we're going over persuasion, rhetorical strategies of logos, ethos, and pathos. We'll be going over the rhetorical triangle, and we'll go over rhetorical analysis specifically. Now I'll have a PowerPoint up. It's called Critical Analysis and Rhetoric, and you'll see those steps of rhetorical analysis at the second section of that PowerPoint. That's not required reading, but it's up for your information, so you can acquaint yourselves more deeply with these terms, especially the rhetorical triangle. It can be tricky. So I'm going to start with looking back, putting on your analytic lens as a reader. Remember the things we talked about with style, that you are writing, your aim as a writer in this kind of persuasive writing or writing to convince, argumentative writing. What you're trying to do is to write to somebody that you have a strong idea of who that audience is, and you're writing to them to demonstrate authority and control. What you're doing as a reader is you're looking for authority and control from the text you are reading, from the author you're reading. When we talk about rhetoric, that author can be called a rhetor. It's R-H-E-T-O-R, and that is someone who is a specific author of rhetoric. So we'll call them the rhetor or the authors, interchangeable. Now, rhetoric started back in the ancient times, Greek and Roman times, where they used rhetoric in a debate forum. So it started as an oral mode of persuasion. And at the time, you're trying to convince, and you see this continually in politics, especially, and we've had a saturation of this kind of mode of rhetoric, and you hear the word bandied about, especially the last couple of weeks with the presidential um, election coming up and the debates going on, and then you'll see one side and the other saying, oh, that's just empty rhetoric, or they're using rhetoric this way. But what it really comes down to is back in the Greek times, they start out with the precepts of how to effectively debate a position in order to not only convince but persuade their audience to do or to act in some way. The better rhetor was the one who won the day. They would have competitions, and you still see this in high schools and colleges on debate teams or forums like that. But what they're looking for the ability to adapt. And they're looking for the concept of what we call the rhetorical triangle, which comes from Aristotle. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later in this lecture, and it's up on the PowerPoint. But the rhetorical triangle looks at the relationship among the three elements in an argument: the author or the rhetor, the audience, and the text itself. So we want to look at that relationship. It's an interchangeable, it's in a triangulated form as we envision it. And all the things that are in play are within the context, what we call kairos, which is why now. It's the rhetorical context, the situation. And we want to talk about that next week. But Kairos specifically also it's not static, it's not set, it adjusts. So if you think about a football player, for example, a quarterback, when they are reading a play, they have a play in mind. They know their audience on the other side, and they know their players, they're part of the audience too. But if they need to adjust quickly, they need to adjust because something is not reacting in the way that they anticipate, so they adjust. They change the play at the line of scrimmage while it's going on. That's kairos in action. They're adjusting to what they're reading. So it's a constant reading back and forth and interchange of audience and author. And then the text itself is what is being adjusted and how the delivery of that. So we want to look at those kind of things when you're doing a rhetorical analysis. So as an analysis, when looking at rhetorical analysis specifically, what is the difference between a rhetorical analysis and a critical analysis? Well, critical analysis is analyzing a text critically with the eye of the critic. We talked about that. But rhetorical analysis is a type of critical analysis where you specifically look at the rhetorical strategies and the rhetorical devices to see how effective that means, that attempt to persuade, how that works. Is it effective, ineffective? Is it persuasive or is it unpersuasive? And what you're looking at specifically is how that author/rhetor is structuring their argument in order to persuade their specific audience. You look at the strategies that they are using. What types of appeals, what of those three appeals are they using? And then next week we'll talk more about the rhetorical devices, which is the stylistics they embed into those appeals, they decorate. So what are the effects of those devices that they use? So you're looking not so much about what they say, but how they say it, how they arrange and structure their argument, how they decorate that argument for the specific aim of persuading a specific target audience. Critical analysis is doing that as well, but specifically for rhetorical analysis, which will be your next paper, we're looking specifically at the rhetorical strategies used and the rhetorical devices. So when we're moving on then, thinking about what a rhetorical analysis, what we're doing as a reader, what we're doing for this next paper, you'll be reading one of the texts that we've talked about in class. You're free to choose any of the texts that we've used in class. What I have for this week for your reading is Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from Birmingham Jail. It's one of his more famous texts that has been especially in the last several years, has come to light more and more as an example of his brilliance as a writer, as someone who understands audience and how to adjust the kairos of his situation. What you want to look at when you're reading through that text, you want to look for the specific appeals that he's making. Where is he using that appeal to logos, the logical appeal? Where is he using the emotional appeal? Where is he using the ethical appeal? Where are they strongest and where are they not as effective? And then think too about the context. When this letter was written in the 1960s, in the early 60s in Birmingham, Alabama, what was going on at the time contextually that can shape how you understand what he's doing as an author slash rhetor? And then in 2020, now, does that appeal, is that as strong now? Is the kairos, does it hold the test of time? Is it as an effective strategy more so now or less? So you can adjust your lens between context of when it was written and what now. And you can hear elements of these kind of conversations about context and analysis if you're interested in ongoing contemporary issues in the Supreme Court justice hearings currently. The Judge Amy Coney Barrett is being asked about her interpretation of law, constitutional ideas, and she goes back to textuality. She says, I look at originality, what I'm looking at is I apply the law at the time it was written. So she has to understand the context of who, what, where, when, and why, when it was written, and that's how she makes her judicial opinions. Her adjudication is based on interpreting the context of the time of when. But what I'm asking you to do in rhetorical analysis specifically is also apply the lens across time to see if that still has effectiveness now. And that's up for grabs. Now, you don't have to do all of these elements in your rhetorical analysis, but you might want to say, for example, King's appeal to ethics is incredibly potent then when it was written because his audience is identified his fellow clergymen. So there is an ethical shared value system that is assumed, but now, in 2020, it may not fall as strongly as maybe the emotional appeals that he makes. So you might want to do a comparison of the effectiveness of appeals between now and then. And you can do cross mixings. You don't have to look at all the appeals, but if you say, you know what, I'm really interested in how he's using his appeal to logic, I'll look at that. That's fine. That's a fine paper. Don't feel you have to do too much, but you have the whole gamut of what we'll be talking about with rhetorical devices and strategies and kairos in your third essay. So read that letter from Birmingham jail, especially get through at least the first 6 pages. It's a long letter, but think about those things in the writing situation we talked about since week 1. The genre is a letter, and when you have a letter, you have certain expectations. You have an identified audience. Dear so-and-so. He tells you right off the bat, my dear fellow clergyman. Can you understand what's going on with that? Is he being satirical in some way? The word dear means many things. It means an implied intimacy in some way, that you are held to somebody's heart in some way, but it can also mean costly. It can be used facetiously if somebody is talking down to you condescendingly and saying, my dear, or they can mean that sincerely. So you want to think about, even from that first address, my dear fellow clergyman, and fellow, is he addressing fellow African American ministers, or is he talking to white ministers? Because that might be a difference in understanding fellowship. And the concept of fellowship is a tenet of his faith. As a Southern Baptist, that's one of his tenets of faith. Is he playing on the concept of fellowship as well, and the understanding of fellow being you and I are in the same cohort, Or are you part of a fellowship of man that has a greater context? You want to think about all those things when you're looking at that address, but thinking about that in terms of genre. And then there is also a place and time that those things take place. So when you're reviewing the writing situation, thinking about the context. Birmingham, Alabama is a very different place from Birmingham, England. So you have to be able to identify, oh, Birmingham, Alabama, what's going on in the early 1960s in Birmingham, Alabama. Who is King? What has he done? What is the project of his nonviolent direct action? That is his primary mantra of his mission, nonviolent direct action. It's very different from what the Black Panthers movement is doing up in the New York area, which is very much about violence and calling to attention to their cause based on in your face rather than nonviolence. There is a tension there too between those two movements, but thinking about those kind of things contextually. What do we know about Alabama and the Deep South? What do we know about his faith and his scholarship, his following? Did he have any skeletons in his closet that might impact how we read this text? Remember, as a critical analyst, you are free to dig and delve to say, how does this background contextual information shape how I understand this text for effectiveness and persuasiveness? Remember, too, the purpose of this text is to persuade, but also what is he asking of his fellow clergymen? Is he saying, hey, you know what? I came down here at your invitation. You are saying that I'm being unwise and untimely, and I beg to differ. Let me show you exactly how timely and wise I am. Look at all the markers of time he puts in his text. It's almost like he's giving them, forgive me for saying, a big FU for daring to say I'm untimely. Let me show you exactly how wise and timely I can be, tucked into my rhetoric here. So these are all the things that you think about when you're doing a rhetorical analysis specifically, or critical analysis generally. Thinking about the subject. What is the subject? Letter from Birmingham jail doesn't really tell you anything. But what is the subject? What does he want? He wants you to be persuaded, but what else does he want his fellow clergymen to do? Remember that action element. Not just to be convinced or persuaded to agree with him, but persuaded to do something. What does he want them to do? And then we want to think about the subject. What is the subject? And then the last bit, the big part, is who is his audience? It is his fellow clergymen. He identifies it. That's the beauty of a letter. But what are the members of that audience? Who are they? What are they? So thinking about that, because the rhetorical triangle is the next thing we're thinking about. When you're coming up with rhetorical strategies, you want to think about that. Who is the target audience? And what is the relationship between the author or the rhetor and that audience? Is it contentious to begin with? Is it collegial in some way? Is there an element of respect, or is there some degree of difference in authority and caste system even? We want to look at those relationships as best we can find them. Rhetorical triangle is an active method of reading where you're understanding as an audience, you're trying to tug the text and own it away from the rhetor or the author. And the author is trying to tug it and pull it back, but also to persuade at the same time. And the text in itself changes. It's not a static text in the act of oral debate or oral rhetoric. But when it's written, it is fixed. But then you also want to remember it has to be adapted as it goes along. It's part of that kairos. So the rhetorical triangle is a little tricky. If you look at the PowerPoint, it will shape it up a little bit. But just thinking about a triangle is just something that's a continuum that doesn't really have one priority point. All of those elements go into shaping the art of the production or the rhetoric, the attempt to persuade. So finally, we're going to go more specifically into thinking about that persuasion and the audience in mind. Think about that the act of persuasion is more than convincing, you're asking somebody to do. And how you're going to do that is you're going to appeal to the whole person. So the audience is not just going to be an egghead sitting there with a brain. You're going to think of the whole person. So mind, body, and what we would call the values or the ethics of that person, the soul in a way. Mind, body, mind, emotion. So thinking about mind, emotion, and virtue. That's one way to think about it. So you'll see correlatives there. So mind, logos, the art of logic. Ethics is the virtue, ethical. And then ethos. And then pathos is the emotion. So as you're looking at how these folks are creating these rhetoricians are creating their arguments, and as you do your own rhetoric in writing, when you create a logical appeal, you are appealing to someone's reason. You're providing logic and proof. If you see appeals to logic that don't offer those things of solid proof or a strong thesis, you can say that's an ineffective or unpersuasive appeal to logic. Or if they're very successful at it, you can say they are appealing to logic highly successfully. If they're appealing to ethics or ethos, they can be appealing to their own credibility, their own character, or they could be appealing to the audiences or both. So in King's letter, for example, he appeals to his own ethics right off the bat. I am a man of highest character. You invited me here. And you invited me here because of my authority as a leader in the Southern Baptist Conference. But he's also appealing to their ethics as well. You're my fellow, you're my clergyman. Applying that term of clergyman insists that they are going to behave ethically because they're expected to be the leaders of someone's ethics or morals. And then thinking about the pathetic appeal, pathos, appealing to emotions. You do this constantly in your own life. You can't help but do it when you're texting somebody, when you're texting a loved one. Hey, I'm gonna be late, sorry, ran into traffic. You're appealing to that emotion that they have been there themselves and can understand it, so they'll forgive you. Or, hey mom, I need a couple of dollars because I'm going out on a date and I want some extra makeup. Or you can look at that appeal, but if your audience is not willing to go along with it, you won't make a successful appeal. For example, my own parents back in the day, my dad was the most logical man ever. If I tried to make an argument to him based on emotion, if I tried to put forth an emotional, pathetic appeal to him, he would just stop me in my tracks and say, cut to the chase, how much money do you need? What do you need? Just tell me what the facts and the proof, and I'll decide. My mother, on the other hand, you had better dance every possible pathetic dance you can dance to get anything out of that woman. And don't you dare appeal to her ethics and don't dare appeal to her logic. You could dab into, well, you're mom and you're the best mom ever, but you really had to lay on the pathos. You had to lay on the emotion. But that was the audience. I knew them. So I knew how to get that $20 from my dad, and I knew how to get that $20 from my mom. It was a very different kind of appeal strategy. You see that in writing. So when you're reading Letter from Birmingham Jail, look at how King shifts his appeals and identify those places where he's very strong in some appeals and some he doesn't rely on as much. So start assessing how he's using those three appeals. Next week, we'll be going into the devices, the stylistics of language. So we call them the rhetorical devices. Metaphors, similes, the word structure, balance, the kinds of things that decorate language. And King is a master at tucking in the devices as well. But we'll work on that some more next week. Consider the so what as part of the agreement for persuasion. And then the last thing I wanted to leave you with is part of the readings for this section for Unit 3. We'll be looking at Dr. Seuss's The Sneetches, because who doesn't want to read a kid's book for an English 122 class? But I want you to look at, when you're reading that text, read it with the same lens of a rhetorical analyst. What is he doing for his emotional and logical and Ethical appeals. What is Seuss doing? He decorates his language, obviously, because it's a kid's book, rhyme and meter, but think about other things in there. And then the last thing I wanted to leave you with is part of the think abouts. I've left that off of the supplemental readings. So where it says framing and coherence, that's from that think abouts PowerPoint. And I'll adjust that on our syllabus. Let me know if you have any questions this week. I hope you're enjoying the class. I hope you're enjoying the beautiful weather. We finally got some beautiful weather, so I hope you're getting a chance to enjoy it. Spend a good time with friends and family, and I will talk with you next week.